Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to Darwin. My name is John Nilsson-Wright. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here for what I hope will be a stimulating and very informative discussion on alliances, in particular alliance relationships between Japan, the United States and the Republic of Korea. This is part of a year-long program funded by the Korea Foundation, which we have been organizing both through the Center for Geopolitics and my faculty, the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. I thought what I might do very briefly is just say a few words of scene setting to try and give you, the members of the audience, some sense of the nature of the project, but also some of the substantive issues that relate to alliances. And to begin with really a question, which is why alliances? Why do they matter? Until recently, you might be forgiven for thinking that alliance relationships and America's alliance relationships were uncontroversial. But if you think back historically, it's probably fair to say that looking back from 1945 and in the aftermath of World War II, there was no necessary assumption that the United States would be able to build effective alliance partnerships with both Japan and South Korea. In the context of Japan, of course, the nature of the war itself between the two countries, a war that the American historian John Dow described as a war without mercy, which of course ended dramatically with those two atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a bitter conflict. It was by no means foreordained that the two countries would be able to build an effective partnership that has lasted 70 years. A partnership that has weathered all manner of challenges, the fractured politics of Japan in the 1940s and 50s, public demoralization on the part of the Japanese public, a clash of, or at least a divergence of interests on the part of the leaders of the two countries, with Japan under the leadership of Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru focusing on economic reconstruction. The kind of traditional ingredients of alliance politics, of security cooperation, was not something that was at the forefront of the thinking of certainly Japanese policymakers at that stage. And of course, during the Cold War, a number of prominent shocks that sometimes threatened to really destabilize bilateral relations between Washington and Tokyo. One thinks back to the 1970s and the presidency of Richard Nixon and the extent to which unilateral decisions by the United States, particularly as it related to policy towards China, created a profound sense of, if not distrust, at least anxiety on the part of Japanese policymakers. But despite that, we saw moments at later decades when the United States and Japan became ever closer. In the 1980s, it was Prime Minister Nakasone who talked about the indivisible bonds between Japan and the West. And prominent American politicians, former American Senator Mike Mansfield, who went on to be the longest serving American ambassador in Japan, described the US-Japan relationship as the most important bilateral relationship, bar none. I think it was a measure of the sense of achievement that had been realized through cooperation between the two countries, but also the critical strategic importance of Japan, where it sat in Asia, underscoring that commitment. So it was no accident that subsequent American leaders would often refer to Japan as the keystone in the arch of American security interests, echoing a statement by George Kennan back in the early days of the Cold War. And that, even in the aftermath of the Cold War, that relationship has continued to flourish. One thinks back to cooperation during the Gulf War. And even when there have been moments of stress and strain in the 1990s, when under Bill Clinton's presidency, there was a lot of concern in Japan about so-called Japan passing, as the United States focused ever more on the relationship with China. Nonetheless, it has been a strong and resilient relationship. And particularly under late Prime Minister Abe, we saw the partnership becoming increasingly global in scope, and certainly in terms of aspirations, but also the rhetorical commitments to a global agenda. Similarly, when it comes to Japan and Korea, one can point to all sorts of unexpected developments, because in 1945, in the aftermath of liberation, most American members of the public and even American policymakers had little understanding of Korea, arguably. And it was only the unanticipated event of the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950 that provided the impetus for American-Korean cooperation. At that stage, of course, all American troops had been withdrawn from the peninsula. Again, it was not foreordained. But as a result of the war, the two countries established a mutual security treaty in 1953, which has endured and become part of a very strong bilateral relationship. The United States has played a key role in Korea as a security guarantor, but also behind the scenes, arguably, with mixed results, depending on where you sit in the political spectrum in South Korea. The United States can be seen as having been behind the scenes, active in trying to foster democracy. Others would take a more critical view, but nonetheless, the relationship has been long-term and increasingly important in the context of the security challenges that North Korea and China represents. It was during the first Trump administration that former Vice President Mike Pence stood in the DMZ and talked about being on freedom's frontier, and why one might question the perhaps exaggerated quality of that statement. It expressed, I think, a very clear sense of bilateral commitment. But those alliances have always been framed by the hub and spokes mechanism. They've been bilateral. And the big challenge has always been thinking about how to join, to complete the third side of the triangle that will bring these three countries ever closer together. Here again, the United States has played a key role. In the 1960s, it was former US Ambassador to Japan, Edwin O. Reischauer, who played a key role in trying to bring Japanese and Korean leaders together to form an effective working alliance. But that was compounded by the legacy of history, distrust on the part of public opinion in both countries, and different strategic priorities. So when, fast forwarding now to August of 2023, when President Biden convened a group, an important meeting at Camp David, the presidential retreat with his South Korean and Japanese counterparts, this marked a real step change in that aspiration to build a working trilateral partnership. And I think notwithstanding all of the historical tensions left over from World War II and the Pacific War, it was clear that there was a common agenda on the part of the three leaders. Part of that was political, on the part of the Biden administration, if you like, future-proofing the close cooperation between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo from disruption from an incoming Trump administration, but also dealing with much more common challenges, both regionally and globally. And that global dimension is again very, very important, I think, in talking about the relationship today. Both South Korea and Japan have demonstrated in their commitment to the IP4, the Indo-Pacific Four, in their participation. Japan, of course, a member of the G7, but South Korea increasingly part of those discussions, that they have common interests that relate to global security defined broadly, not just in military terms, but also economic and diplomatic. All of that, however, arguably, has now been thrown into a little bit of uncertainty by the advent of the new Trump administration and his much more transactional approach. And while the rhetoric is very positive, those of us who visit the region, I would say, pick up from time to time a sense of genuine anxiety on the part of South Korean and Japanese officials about how sustainable the bilateral and trilateral relationship is. And it's not purely a function of the fallout from Trump's approach to tariffs and his more combative transactional economic policy. Even in the sphere of security, arguably, there are concerns about the sustainability and reliability of extended deterrence and the American commitment. Just to give you one illustration of this, one opinion poll in Japan a few months ago indicated that 70% of the Japanese public feel that in the event of a security crisis in the region, the United States could not be counted on to come to the defense of Japan. And that's a remarkable expression of public anxiety, especially given all the progress that was achieved over many years. So our question, in a way, in looking forward, as part of this project, is, are we at a real inflection point? It's a much overused phrase, but are we seeing some real fundamental changes in the structure of bilateral and trilateral alliance or proto-alliance cooperation? Will the pressure from the Trump administration, particularly on Japan and South Korea to do more for defense, prove too costly? The level of expectation in Washington in terms of how much Japan and South Korea should pony up to demonstrate their commitment to the United States and to support the US economy is putting real strains at home on both countries. And perhaps most importantly of all, trust, a really important ingredient in alliance relations, has been arguably severely challenged, if not damaged, by the events of the last few months. But anxiety can also be a handmaiden for cooperation and innovation. And out of this sense of uncertainty has come, I think, quite remarkable new cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. We saw that in the decision by President Lee, the recently elected South Korean president, to visit Japan prior to his meeting with Donald Trump. We've seen all sorts of cooperation in the security space, meetings even between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Lee just recently in Busan. But there is also, even allowing for that common incentive to work together, given changes in domestic politics, there is a danger that the uncertainty surrounding the United States might encourage leaders, not just in Japan and South Korea, to turn inwards or to become more nationalistic. We've just had an election in Japan for the leadership of the LDP, and the successful candidate has sometimes been painted, rightly or wrongly, as a nationalist. Given the continuing salience of historical tensions between South Korea and Japan, how will she, if she is elected as Prime Minister in a few days' time, how will she navigate the relationship with South Korea? And what role will populism play, whether in Japan and South Korea, in complicating cooperation between alliances? So the future is somewhat murky, not opaque, but certainly unclear. And that's what we want to explore, as well as discussing the past and the present. And we have a wonderful set of speakers, two each from the three countries that we're looking at, with a range of different backgrounds, from academia, from think tanks, from the media, and different generational representatives. So I'm delighted to welcome you all here for what I'm sure is going to be a really fascinating discussion. Last but not least, I should also thank our chairs and discussants, who perhaps represent local voices, not all, but in some cases local voices, because in this changing environment, we also perhaps want to think about new partnerships, bilateral, mini and multilateral, involving European voices and European actors. But I'm sure that will come up in our discussion. So without further ado, let me welcome you again, invite Giulia Garbani, who will be chairing the first panel, to bring our first panel up to begin our proceedings. One final point to mention: this is being filmed. It is on the record. So there will be some limits to how frank we can be, but hopefully that won't detract from what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting discussion. Anyway, Giulia, over to you.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to today's first panel of the workshop. My name is Giulia Garbani. I'm a JRF, a Junior Research Fellow at Fitzwilliam College. And let me start by thanking John, the Center for Geopolitics, Peter, for putting together such a fantastic event, and for allowing me to chair a panel with such an exciting lineup of experts, whom I'll introduce very briefly before we start with the discussion. So our first speaker is Professor Yoon Young Kwan, who is chairman of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies and Professor Emeritus of Political Science and International Relations at Seoul National University, and also former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Korea. Then we have Mr. Hiroyuki Akita, who is a foreign and security affairs commentator of Nikkei, who served as correspondent from Beijing, Washington, and London, among others, throughout his career as a journalist. Third up, Dr. Sheila Smith, Johnny Miro Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, our discussant, Dr. Edward Howell, who is lecturer in international relations at the University of Oxford, Korea Foundation Fellow at Chatham House, and a research fellow with the Faros Foundation. Let me just remind you that you have around 10 minutes for each of your remarks, so that we can have ample time for Q&A and discussion at the end. And I must start with a confession as a historian, tying into what John was saying about the the third missing link of the triangular relationship. When it comes to Japan and South Korea relations in particular, I think that looking at the history of their relations, one has to approach the idea of cooperation with a certain degree of caution, because obviously history shows that Japan and South Korea have very much had a pendulum type of relationship going every 10 to 15 years. There is a moment of cooperation and rapprochement, and sadly that often ends with again, a cooling of relations. So I'm very ready to be proved wrong of my skepticism today and to be convinced that things are different now. So I'll be very keen on keeping our eye on the past, but also looking at the present and seeing how things are radically different. So I would like to start with Professor Yoon and ask him to ease us into the conversation on the Camp David agreement, exactly what the new type of cooperation entails, and what factors, both domestic and international, you think made this new type of cooperation possible. Over to you, Professor Yoon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garbani. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor John Nielsen Wright for inviting me to this very important, meaningful roundtable. The United States has long sought to maintain strong trilateral security cooperation with its allies, Republic of Korea and Japan. For instance, in the Nixon-Sato joint communique of November 1969, both leaders declared that the security of the Republic of Korea is essential to the security of Japan. This became an early blueprint for the subsequent diplomatic efforts toward trilateral coordination. However, political tensions between Seoul and Tokyo over the historical and territorial issues have long weakened this linkage, making it difficult to achieve truly robust trilateral cooperation among three allies. So one made the historic Camp David summit in August 2023 possible. In my view, global, regional, and personal leadership factors all contributed to the breakthrough. First, the global factor. Looking back, the summit took place during a period when the rules-based international order still commanded broad commitment, and the United States had not yet retreated from its global leadership role in upholding that order. As stated in the leaders' joint declaration, the spirit of Camp David, President Biden, President Yoon, and Prime Minister Kishida affirmed, quote, "We will support a free and open international order based on the rule of law and bolster regional and global peace and security," unquote. This statement reflected, in particular, President Biden's firm conviction that a united front among like-minded democracies was essential in countering states that defy international norms. Second, the regional context also played an important role. First, Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine was a kind of violation of fundamental principle of territorial sovereignty. And second, China's increasingly assertive behavior in South China Sea and across the Taiwan Strait raised regional alarm. Third, North Korea's escalating nuclear and missile threats posed direct dangers to all three countries. These converging threats heightened the perception of shared risk and strengthened their trilateral cooperation. Finally, personal leadership factor was also important. President Yoon Suk-yeol's decision to depart from his predecessor's Moon Jae-in Moon Jae-in's unyielding approach to Japan was pivotal. As a conservative politician, he made a politically risky yet strategic choice to improve the ROK-Japan relations despite strong domestic criticisms. Also, Prime Minister Kishida responded constructively. At the Camp David press conference, he stated, quote, "I have strong feelings about strengthening bilateral relations between the Republic of Korea and Japan. I share that view with President Yoon," unquote. President Biden's leadership and timing were also essential. Recognizing a rare diplomatic opening created by President Yoon's initiative, he invited both leaders to Camp David and succeeded in institutionalizing trilateral cooperation. So those three leaders could agree, first, to institutionalize cooperation through annual leaders' summits and regular ministerial dialogues. Second, adopt a commitment to consult mechanism, creating a political pledge to coordinate responses in times of regional crisis. Third, launch multi-domain joint military exercises and cybersecurity collaboration against North Korea's military threats and illicit activities. Fourth, reaffirm shared principles of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And fifth, support the complete denuclearization of North Korea. And finally, deepen cooperation on supply chain resilience, critical technologies, and economic security, as well as on climate and development efforts. And in just 2 years since the conclusion of the Camp David Agreement, security and defense officials from those three countries have met more than 80 times at various levels of government. They also conducted their first multi-domain joint military exercise. In parallel, numerous additional dialogues have been held to deepen cooperation in economic, financial, technological, and people-to-people areas. On the other hand, the ROK-Japan relations have significantly improved. For example, President Yoon met his Japanese counterparts 12 times during his last 2.5 years. And President Lee met Prime Minister Ishiba 3 times in 4 months. This demonstrates an exceptionally active top-level communication. According to a survey by a Korean think tank, the favorability toward Japan among Koreans was 12.3% in 2020, but it rose to 63.3% this year. Now, what is the current state of trilateralism? Frankly, it hangs in the balance, in my view. The three leaders who championed the spirit of Camp David have all left office. In Korea, the newly elected progressive president, Lee Jae-myung, has nonetheless chosen to continue the policy of strong trilateral coordination. Though he had criticized President Yoon's Japan policy during the presidential campaign, after his election, President Lee Jae-myung emphasized consistency in foreign policy. He also reaffirmed that the ROK-US alliance would remain the cornerstone of his foreign policy. In Japan, Ms. Sanae Takaichi, a conservative politician, is about to assume office as prime minister. Her position on Korea and trilateral cooperation remains uncertain. I hope she too will carry forward Prime Minister Ishiba's pragmatic approach, just as President Lee has built upon President Yoon's initiative. At this moment of profound uncertainty in international relations, there are compelling reasons for even stronger Korea-Japan cooperation. Another major question concerns the Trump 2.0 in the United States. It is still unclear how President Trump views trilateral cooperation in his mind. He may seek to leverage trilateral cooperation as a means of addressing the Chinese challenge more effectively. However, we cannot rule out the possibility that as a realist politician grounded in power politics, he might instead pursue a grand bargain with China, a move that could potentially usher in a new era of sphere of influence politics in international relations. Let me close by recalling a few other statements made by the three leaders at Camp David only 26 months ago. Yet they now sound as if they belong to a completely different era. Quote, "We will strengthen our coordination on promoting democracy and protecting human rights. We share concerns about actions inconsistent with the rules-based international order, which undermine regional peace and prosperity. The United States unequivocally reaffirms that its extended deterrence commitments to both Japan and the Republic of Korea are ironclad and backed by the full range of US capabilities," unquote. If my memory is correct, President Trump has not yet made this kind of firm and clear statements regarding US commitments to those two allies. How large a gap do you feel between those words made by three leaders and today's international reality? If you, like me, sense that the gap has been widening, you may also share my cautious concern about the future direction of trilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yoon. As you mentioned, it's really a matter of finding a balance between the working level institutionalization and the role that leaders can play and how different things can look when leaders change. So on that note, I actually wanted to ask Mr. Akita what was his impression of the role of individuals, personalities in shaping the Camp David Agreement, and how you see also the present situation.
So thank you very much for having me. This is the first time for me to come to Cambridge. And after I arrived here, since then, I feel like I have stepped into the world of Harry Potter, expecting some movie character appears to say hello to me. I'm sure that my son will envy if he knows that. He's a big fan of Harry Potter. But in my 10 minutes comment, I'd like to compare the development of trilateral cooperation to planting forest. But to begin with, I have to confess that most of my prepared comment overlap with the. I expect that we can differentiate quite significantly between Seoul and Tokyo, but it's kind of there is overlap. But let me provide my view based on my observation from Tokyo. So. If trilateral cooperation is like planting a forest, three conditions have to be met to grow the forest to well. First is I go opposite that order from the personal commitment by a leader to plant trees, and then second level is a regional climate that allows forest, namely trilateral cooperation, to grow, forest grow faster. And thirdly, we need a global security environment that sustain the forest over time. And I think until the end of last year, all these three conditions have been met. But I'm not so sure about today because of Mr. Trump as factor mainly. But this session is mainly deal with the past and present. So let me just touch upon Trump factor at the end of my comment. So if I look at each layer, let me look at each layer. So first, to begin with, personal commitment by a leader. I strongly believe that it was President Yoon who played a decisive role to enhance trilateral cooperation by improving bilateral relation between Tokyo and Seoul. He understood that it is necessary for both countries to improve the relation to tackle with a series of security challenges coming from North Korea and China. And then that encouraged Prime Minister Kishida of Japan to respond quite positively. So in the forest building effort, I think it was President Yoon who picked up the shovel and started planting a tree. But as he, a Korean panelist mentioned, that was not enough. So at the second level, there was a regional security climate that brought Japan and Korea and US together. Namely, it is a North Korean accelerated nuclear program. And also after the Russian invasion, North Korea expanded the military cooperation with Russia. So in return, now North Korean soldiers is fighting in Europe. And in return, Russia allegedly, Russia is providing more sophisticated military technology and also equipment. So in this context, there is a strong need for Japan, Korea, South Korea to improve its relation and to better deal with this threat. Also, due to China's more assertive behavior in past few years, Seoul and Tokyo increasingly started to look China through the same lens, same threat perception. So that was a second layer. And then on the top of that, there is a global factor. That is intensified US-China's strategic rivalry. Due to this strategic rivalry, Korean Peninsula became another flashpoint, strategic flashpoint, as well as Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. So in this context, China appears to prefer maintaining the division of the Korean Peninsula rather than supporting reunification of South and North. Because North Korea has become a more important buffer state to counter US sphere of influence. Now China almost seems to be accepting North Korea, tacitly accepting North Korea as a nuclear state, as well as Russia. Russia does it more explicitly, but China also do not necessarily pressure North Korea to abandon nukes. So this is kind of like a new emerging dynamism in which Japan and South Korea and US have to collaborate more closer to deal with not only North Korea, but also China's strategic geopolitical competition vis-a-vis China. So this is a three layers context in which this trilateral cooperation have been evolving. But in conclusion, I'm not sure that this trend will last next year, or maybe not next week, because of Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's approach is completely different. He three differences. First, maybe he is more willing to directly engage North Korea over the head of South Korea and Japan to deal with the North Korean nuclear problem. So after achieving the peace accord, or ceasefire in Gaza, I'm sure that he will engage North Korea. Maybe he may try to visit North Korea at the occasion of APEC in South Korea. So this is completely different from the alliance-based approach. This is the first difference. Then second difference is more fundamental. Maybe he believed in more like a neo-Yalta type of world order, not a rule-based or alliance-based order. Neo-Yalta means that great power will negotiate whether they are enemy or adversary or ally. They negotiate and then make a deal to maintain, from Trump's point of view, to maintain the stability in the world. So, but this approach, if neo-Yalta approach will emerge under Trump administration, maybe there's less room for Japan and South Korea to have a leverage against China and North Korea. So this is the second one. But third, potentially, it may be possible that Mr. Trump even may not have the concept of geopolitics. Yeah. Maybe he is a kind of permanent poker player. So he wants to keep playing poker and keep winning, but there aren't any clear end game. If that is the case, maybe end game could be worse than Neo-Yalta. It could be like a disorder. So this will be a completely different vision of the world, prospect of the world. But I'm sure that the next session will deal with this. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Akita-san. Thank you for bringing in the elephant in the room, President Trump. And I'm very glad that we have Sheila now to help us make sense of what's going on in Washington, D.C. And I share the pessimism of Hiro. But at the same time, I also remember a lot of commentators after the Munich summit being somewhat relieved that Foreign Secretary Rubio seemed to be a bit more measured in its approach to East Asia. So I really wanted to ask you, Sheila, how much change and continuity is there in the US in terms of approach to both bilaterally, South Korea and Japan, and also in trilateral terms?
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. And again, thank you, John, and Darwin College and Cambridge University for inviting me. It's a delight to be here. It's not a delight to have to talk about my government, but I will do my best to retreat to the trilateral and then attempt to answer Julia's question. 3 points really about the trilateral past, present in that framing that you so kindly gave us, John, in the questions that you sent and also in your opening remarks. I had to smile. The past for British scholars goes way further back than for American scholars. I'm starting in a very narrow sense of the word past. But I thought what I'd do is start off just to give you a little bit of background from up close and personal in Washington on what was going on in the Biden administration, what led to Camp David, and the tremendous outcome. I agree with both Ambassador Yoon and Akita-san on how constructive it was. But I think it's from the American perspective, and this is a Biden folks, you know them all well, but this was part of a consolidated effort to develop an Indo-Pacific strategy. And then, of course, it was punctuated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which then extended this Indo-Pacific vision to a larger global defense of the rules-based order, as Mr. Yoon pointed out. But I think we ought to see the trilateral in that framing because it was framed that way from the beginning. But it was also secondarily an exercise, and John used the word trust in his opening remarks. It was very much an exercise in repair at the very beginning. Because, of course, as you know, the Japan-ROK relationship had gone through a period of fairly devastating conflict. And so getting it back on track, not getting the Japan-ROK relationship back on track, but getting the trilateral conversation on shared strategic interest as well as shared values was really, really important. So at the very early stage, and it didn't get a lot of the headlines because the Quad got lots of headlines, the broader regional focus got the headlines, but the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, went to the region, met with the National Security Advisor in Seoul and in Tokyo. The head of our Joint Chiefs of Staff went similarly to the region, met with the Joint Chief of Staff heads in both Seoul and Tokyo. And then our intelligence chief, Haynes, went out to talk to the intelligence leaders in both of our allied capitals. So you had a very sustained effort to, at the highest level, at least in our security dialogue, to get on track a common conversation about what was happening in the region, and very specifically Northeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula, but also what needed to happen in the strategic relationship. So I think that's really, really important. The second piece, and this is more specific to the US-ROK relationship, but you'll also recall there was a conversation in the US-ROK relationship about nuclear deterrence and about extended deterrence specifically. So the Washington Declaration in the bilateral, when President Yoon came to Washington, the Washington Declaration was a very strong statement that the United States would offer strategic protection for South Korea, and South Korea would reassert and reaffirm its commitment to the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, right? And there was going to be ways in which the United States would express and demonstrate its willingness to offer the full range of our capabilities to defend South Korea against the North. It's a very important building block to getting to where we ended up with a Camp David trilat that we shouldn't forget. Phnom Penh, another moment where you see the trilateral start to embrace Indo-Pacific goals. So for the first time, you hear the South Korea is coming in to talk about, I think, John, you mentioned supply chain issues, but the economic security agenda and the way in which this trilateral could contribute to strengthening that, but also inviting Seoul, and President Yoon's administration was very determined to have a voice in the conversation about supply chain resilience and other types of technology innovation. So this is another piece of the building block that gets us to that very important Camp David moment. I think, China hovers, of course, behind us here. North Korea hovers behind a lot of this. But I think it was also, I think several of the speakers mentioned the word institutionalizing sustained cooperation across multiple sectors, policy sectors in the trilateral relationship, even in the end establishing a secretariat, right, ostensibly, right? So this was the idea. I'm sure it was Trump-proofing, but it was also trying to protect the relationship from the ups and downs, inevitably, of political tensions as well. That's where my second point is here for the trilateral. I think it's still true, and I'm not saying this to diminish the American role, but I think it's still very true that the vulnerability of the trilateral to Japan-ROK political change, leadership changes in particular, is still there. So I, too, am a little bit worried, cautiously concerned. I think Mr. Yoon's language there is very, very diplomatic, but very on point, I think. We're all cautiously concerned, and I think we should be. And that, I too give President Yoon tremendous credit in beginning the process of bilateral repair that, again, Prime Minister Kishida responded to. And in 2023, you had the forced labor issue being addressed, the export controls being lifted by Japan, the contaminated water in Fukushima. Don't remember, there's still another issue. There's a series of issues that got directly addressed by both leaders and worked through. And again, I think Ishiba-san really carried that ball forward from Prime Minister Kishida. Little anecdote, Washington anecdotes are always fun. When I talked to the Biden folks about the transition in Japanese leadership, Prime Minister Kishida apparently wrote or reached out to them to say that the trilateral was his legacy and that he would ensure that that legacy would be protected by Prime Minister Ishiba going forward. So there is a deep, not only do leaders matter, but leaders also have a deep investment in what happens, especially when there's progress made. And I think analytically we should keep that in mind. Now there's lots of yeses, lots of changes that are in the positive domain here, but I just wanted to alert, just to sort of put a little flag up for things that didn't happen in the relationship, and it's important in our discussion. We can talk more about it. One is the Biden folks stepped back from the idea that there was a direct American-U.S. government role in the bilateral Japan ROK. And I think it's really important, and I hope our Japanese participants in the audience, especially if you're from the Japanese government, will speak to this. But there was a time when, in the Obama era, the U.S. was a facilitator of improvement. Even before that, the word mediator kept getting used. But I think real reconciliation and trust building really depended on the U.S. government stepping back, and allowing the leaders of both South Korea and Japan to take first the front row and to have the agency in that relationship. So I think that's one piece that's really important, and that was a learning, I think, over time for the U.S. policymakers. The second is there was no shared position on extended deterrence. So at some point, the Washington Declaration, there was a hope that it would be U.S., Japan, South Korea could have some kind of shared statement. And I think Japan was uncomfortable with that. The ballistic missile defense arrangements and the integration of ballistic missile defense, communication, intelligence sharing, real-time intelligence sharing, that was great. But extended deterrence manifests itself differently in each alliance. And so there was not an embrace of the idea that the Washington Declaration could extend also to include Japan. So today, I'm not going to go into where we are. We have a whole panel after us. I will give the U.S. baton to Jeffrey to talk about the Trump administration. But I think there are several pieces here that we should watch for the Trump administration's management of the trilateral. Let me finish, Julia, with the last piece. I think geopolitics, geostrategic change, and very specifically the war in Europe. This was a plan by the three parties in the trilateral, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine really accelerated a lot of opportunity for trilateral cooperation and alignment, the word that we are using for the conference. So whether it's in the G7, even though South Korea is not a member, whether it's in NATO and the partnership of the Indo-Pacific Four with NATO, you have a lot more opportunity here for Seoul and Tokyo to think about and express their desire to align themselves on tasks beyond the original conception of what they were trying to get done. I think also that the Moscow-Pyongyang security agreement puts added pressure now on the strategic coordination in the trilateral. And again, we're not quite sure yet how far this Moscow-Pyongyang agreement is going to go. But certainly on questions of nuclear extended deterrence, the question of whether or not a nuclear coercion a la Putin in Europe could become part of what the alliances have to think about in Northeast Asia as well. This is both Koreas, as you mentioned earlier, are now engaged in the Ukraine, right? Have become involved in European security in ways that we wouldn't have imagined if we had gathered here a few years ago, right? And then the last is obviously about us, and I'll keep it at the macro as opposed to the specific about the Trump administration. I think I'm a little bit positive to see both President Lee in his meeting with President Trump, as well as an earlier meeting between Prime Minister Ishiba and President Trump, that the trilateral was part of the dialogue. And it was noted, it was accepted, it wasn't contested, so there's continuity there. What I think the discontinuity could potentially be is our strategy. In a month or so, or a week or so, or who knows, you will see our national defense strategy. There is a tension there. Jeffrey's nodding and smiling, but all of us are waiting to see what that document actually looks like. Is it going to be all about homeland security? Is it going to change the way the American, at least the military establishment, security establishment, looks at the strategic challenge of China? This will have spillover effects, obviously, to our trilateral. But the bottom line is, I think we are in a moment of U.S. retrenchment, however you call it, however you want to look at it. Either it's a result of strategic change, political change in America, or just a re-emphasis of burden sharing. And I think the U.S. offer of strategic protection, even to allies as critical to our future as South Korea and Japan, will come with a cost, will come with new terms. And I think we'll watch the negotiation of those new terms over the course of the next couple of years. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Sheila. So now over to Edward for his comments. There's plenty on the table for you to comment on.
Thank you very much, Julia. I'm going to offer a few comments just for all of the panelists, given how there's a lot of relationship between what has been said. Is this working? And if we just look at the title of today's event, the past, present and future, I'm from Oxford, and I would have placed an Oxford comma after the word present. And the reason I say this is actually it makes quite an interesting point, if you excuse my very poor joke, which is how does the present affect the future? And this will be a discussion that we'll have later on today. But also, as we've heard earlier, what about the past and the present? And this idea of continuity and change, I'd like to probe a little bit, not just between Biden and Trump 2.0, but also between Trump 1.0, the first Trump administration, and the Trump second, and what we've seen so far. We might say that we are yet to see any real disengagement on the part of the US from the Indo-Pacific. In practice, even though rhetorically we've seen quite a few things at play, and the things we've seen rhetorically have been said before in the first Trump administration. So we've seen Trump call for potential troop withdrawal. I mean, Trump seems unable to gauge the number of US forces stationed in Korea. There were numerous times when he's got the number wrong. But what about issues of cost sharing and burden sharing? How can the US-ROK-Japan relationship continue, and particularly the US-ROK bilateral relationship, if we are to see the cost sharing and burden sharing continue in the way that Trump has envisaged? I'm not saying that the South Koreans should pay the amount that Trump has said, but this has been a constant call under Trump and Moon Jae-in, and now we're seeing this again. What about strategic flexibility here, particularly within the US-ROK relationship? One of the questions that I'd like to ask the panelists is this US-ROK-Japan trilateral cooperation serving a broader regional role in the East Asian region? When we speak of strategic flexibility of particularly the US forces in Korea, this might lead to tensions between Seoul and Washington at the moment. We have the Lee Jae-myung administration perhaps signaling that South Korea doesn't really want to get involved in any regional conflict. Right? If we take Lee Jae-myung's past statements, saying that actually, well, we should just say "xie" to both China and Taiwan, okay, pre-election. So what does this mean for South Korea's broader role and the US-ROK relationship? And I think just finally, in terms of continuity and change, how long-term is this US change? Is it permanent, or is it just an aberration? How can the US-ROK-Japan relationship develop beyond the second Trump administration? If we go back to the Biden administration and the Camp David summit, we've heard a lot of very interesting points by all the speakers about the role of leadership. All three leaders now no longer in power. But one of the things that the Biden administration focused on more than deterring adversaries was reassuring allies. We must remember that during the Biden administration there was the infamous press conference by Yoon Suk-yeol when he raised the possibility that South Korea might develop nuclear weapons of its own if the North Korean nuclear threat did not abate. And this question of balancing reassuring allies and deterring adversaries, one might say for Biden, this idea of diplomacy and deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea didn't really work. Linked to this is what this means for South Korea and Japan in terms of the dilemma between entrapment and abandonment. How does Seoul and Tokyo navigate this dilemma, which, if you go back to academic literature, seems typical of any alliance partner? If we situate the US-ROK-Japan trilateral relationship within the broader Indo-Pacific goals, what does this mean with respect to the respective foreign policies of individual leaders? If I just focus on South Korea for a moment, we've seen the rhetoric shift, predictably, from the global pivotal state and the values-oriented approach of Yoon Suk-yeol to the pragmatic diplomacy of Lee Jae-myung. And actually, since the 3rd of June, the South Korean government under President Lee have tried to define this pragmatic foreign policy. I don't think we're quite there yet, but what might this mean in terms of both multilateralism, trilateralism, but also minilateralism in terms of the role for South Korea in the broader region? I've got two more sort of points just to consider, and the first is the Ukraine war. I think the Ukraine war made very clear, if it was not clear already, that the theatres of the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic are not divided. Now, whether this is one Seoul theatre, this sort of one theatre complex, as has been mentioned before by members of the Ishiba administration, or whether this is two separate theatres sprouting from one theatre or moving together, that's up for debate. But this interconnectedness between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic basically signals that what is a war in Europe is also East Asia's problem, right? You had Ishiba's infamous statement that Ukraine today the situation in Ukraine today, well, is not completely dissociated from what's happening in East Asia, okay? Japan tomorrow. So what does this interconnectedness mean for trilateralism, but also South Korea, Japan's, and even with the US's engagement with other Western allies and partners, in particular the United Kingdom? Under former Prime Minister Sunak and former President Yoon, we saw the signing of the Downing Street Accord between London and Seoul, which emphasised that actually Seoul was not just an economic partner for London, but something more. Is there a role that the UK and other European states can play in terms of regional security? And I guess my final point is to do with individual leaders. We've got, obviously, this is a very timely event with the leadership change in Tokyo, but also the fact that in a couple of hours, maybe, more than a couple of hours, we will have the military parade in North Korea, as we've seen with Russian and Chinese and other delegations being invited. We've all seen the scenes from over a month ago on the 3rd of September when Xi Jinping and Putin and others were invited to Beijing for the Victory Day parade there. So firstly, will great power politics, and we've heard from Mr. Akita of Trump being a realist, actually constrain the domestic change in South Korea and Japan from changing their approaches to trilateralism, irrespective of the personal preferences of the leaders? That's the first point. And the second and more broader point is, what can the US, South Korea and Japan and the broader West do to combat this rising axis, for lack of a better word, of authoritarianism that we're seeing between China, North Korea, Russia, you could add Iran, and other states? I'll pause there. I think I've asked lots of questions, hardly easy questions, but I hope this offers a fruitful starting point for discussion, not just amongst the panelists, but the audience as well.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Edward. Before getting into the Q&A, I wanted to offer an opportunity to the speakers to answer not all, perhaps, but any of the very thought-provoking questions that Edward posed. In any order, you can. Should we start with Professor Yoon? Whichever you want.
I agree with your view that there's a kind of interconnectedness between security threats in Europe and in Indo-Pacific. I think that seems to be kind of a mainstream European view. But I think this, kind of contradicts, for example, U.S. policy of, U.S. strategy of prioritization and mainly initiated by Edward Colby, Undersecretary of Defense. So it's a kind of dilemma. I also agree with the perception that what happens in the Ukraine war will affect Korean Peninsula situation. For example, if Ukraine war ends in a way that provides Russian leader Putin a kind of political victory that will encourage authoritarian leaders in China or North Korea become more emboldened. And there's that kind of connection. But Colby, for example, argues that the United States should mainly focus on China and leave other regions to take care of their own security. So how to harmonize, that kind of contradiction between the two, that remains one of the most important questions in coming years. Also, regarding President Lee Jae-myung's policy, yes, I think he is situated in a very difficult situation. On the one hand, he has to manage, American pressure, for example, demanding South Korea pay more in terms of defense budget. Also invest $350 billion in the United States. This is a difficult situation, a difficult demand for South Koreans. For example, according to my friend economist, if there is a capital outflow of 10% of Korean GDP, that will make stock market crash, or all the economic indicators worsen rapidly. And nowadays, President Trump is demanding about 20% of Korean GDP to be invested in South Korea. So he has to handle this kind of pressure from the United States. But domestically, I think he has a dilemma because he is from progressive camp, and his supporters so far have been quiet. When he took a kind of balanced diplomacy, reasonable diplomacy, emphasizing consistency in Korea's foreign policy. But if South Koreans feel humiliated, and if the result of bilateral negotiation becomes pretty kind of bad, I don't know whether those progressive camp people, President Lee Jae-myung's supporters, will remain quiet. So it's a kind of big domestic political problem, and we are facing that kind of dilemma here. I sincerely hope that the United States, U.S. leaders, understand this kind of dilemma, Korean dilemma, and become more kind of flexible and in its demand for investment issues. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick point. One is on the connectivity of the Europe and Asian strategic picture landscape, and second is about Trump, Mr. Trump's foreign policy and whether it is individual or long-term trend. So on the first point, I think perception in Tokyo, especially among leadership, is that what is happening in Europe will sooner or later will spill over to Asia. That is not just observation based on current situation, but it is also observation from the history. When you look at World War I, World War II, and also Cold War, all these wars started in Europe and spill over to Asia. World War II was triggered in Asia, spilled over by some island country which attacked Pearl Harbor. So I think that their history also proves that there's a connectivity. And then on the top of that, there is a North Korea and Russia military cooperation. Again, North Korea is fighting in Ukraine, and Russia is reciprocating it by providing more military assistance. And also China is more cautious not to provide weaponry to Russia, but according to a US estimate, China provides more than 70 to 76% of machinery and semiconductors to Russia that they need to mass produce military weapons. So there is a connectivity already. So this is, I think this is a perception myself and also in Tokyo. And then on the second point, Trump, I think that everybody, I think, could agree that Trump is not the root cause of the root cause that changed the course of U.S. foreign policy, but it's more or less a symptom, because it is not Mr. Trump who said U.S. will not play the role of world policeman anymore, but it was President Obama in 2013, and it was Mr. Biden who, withdrew from Afghanistan, and Obama also committed to withdraw Afghanistan. So I think that the U.S. is facing new moment of the history in which they are more willing to focus on U.S. domestic affairs. And it is nothing new. When you look at U.S. have a DNA that that tries to avoid engagement or entanglement to the war in Europe or Asia. When we look at the World War I, World War II, U.S. was very, very unwilling to engage militarily commit to Europe, even though in the world. During World War II, even though Europe was occupied by Germany, except UK, but the US was unwilling to engage. So I think it is a kind of like a historical cycle that we are facing, rather than, and Mr. Trump could be the symptom or indicator. But to conclude, but after all, US couldn't isolate itself. Something happened. World War I, World War II, Pearl Harbor, and also 9/11. So I'm not too pessimistic in long run. Thank you.
Oh dear, so much to say here. Let me concentrate on your question or your comments on the troop withdrawal, cost sharing, burden sharing, strategic flexibility side of what you're observing from Trump 1 and Trump 2. And I think you're right. It didn't start with Trump 2.0. And I think, again, I would make the same case that Akita-san made, which is, and I do it from a slightly different perspective than the policy negotiations here when I'm making this comment, is I think for the American people, and again, this is anecdotal and we don't have hard evidence to support it, but for the American people, this question of America's global role is deeply under investigation, under thought. And so it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether you're a Trump Republican or not. I think you can see also signs in the Democratic Party, a generational change in terms of attitudes, of priorities for the United States and our foreign policy engagement around the world, especially and not or including our allies, is an important factor that's being debated in different ways. I think what's different, and Mr. Yoon brought this up in his remarks, and I'll sort of frame that slightly in a different way. What I think is different in the negotiation, the policy negotiation and the alliances, and I was calling this retrenchment and the cost of strategic protection is the language I was using, but is that the Trump administration is using economic tools in ways that we haven't seen in the past. So the tariffs, right? The 20% of the South Korean economy to be invested in the United States. This is a cost of alliance. This is an imposition of a cost or a price. Let's put it that way. Maybe a price is a better language. It's also the kind of terminology we used to use to describe China, which was economic coercion, right? So you're starting to see major powers use the economic framing of friendship, partnership, right, in different ways. And I think that's the part about It was there in the first Trump administration, but it has returned with a vengeance in the second. I would say, and I don't know, I think what's ahead of us here, at least in the Japan case, is host nation support. So that 5-year agreement, and I hope our second panel will talk about it, that's coming up. The Japanese managed to sidestep it. In the first Trump administration, they ran the clock out at the end. The South Koreans did not sidestep it, but had a very difficult time, I think, in the first Trump administration, dealing with the cost or the share that Seoul would pay for the presence of U.S. forces. Now we have Secretary Hegseth in Shangri-La in Singapore saying that we expect our Asia-Pacific allies to pay the same as Europeans, 5% of their defense. So it's not just cost sharing for U.S. forces, but this larger number. To my knowledge, and I could be just not well informed, but only Australia has been given a specific number of GDP, which is 3.5. My Japanese friends in the government say that there has not been a specific ask, but we all expect that it's coming, right? I was intrigued by your mention also of strategic flexibility, and I'll just make a very simple point that I hope we can discuss when we open up, is Taiwan, right? And so in Washington, we have a lot of these conversations, trilateral and tabletop exercises, the what-if scenarios, and I don't have classified clearance, so unlike Jeffrey, I have a very I have an overview approach to this. But I think it's increasingly obvious that in the U.S.-South Korean relationship, this question of a Taiwan contingency has become much, much more a part of the conversation. So strategic flexibility in the sense that you can fight or you can enter into combat from Korean soil anywhere may not be fully on the table. But the ask on Taiwan, I think, is going to be very specifically on the table, and as well as for Japan. I'm going to take a little issue with Akita-san. We have these conversations bilaterally a lot. I don't see President Trump as a realist. I think President Trump is, I like the poker player analogy. I think that's closer. But I do, no, I think it's good. I think it's right. But I don't see him as a realist in the sense of the old Hans Morgenthau calculus, right? That's just not who he is. He is a political being. He is a deal maker. He's very much in the moment, and his goals change in the moment. And we've seen that in this first 10 months? I don't know how many. It feels like 10 years when you live in Washington. But we're only 10 months into the first year of a 4-year administration, right? And you can see this, that the tactical shift in any particular deal changes in very short term, right? So I think that's one of the pieces I would ask our Japanese colleagues and maybe our South Korean colleagues to resist this realist framing or thinking of a long-term strategy at the moment. We may have more texture later on to start talking about a Trump doctrine, but that's not the way that this president operates. We were all convinced he was an isolationist in Trump 1.0. Now we're thinking he's a spheres of influence guy. So we're imposing some of these frames, and I would just urge you to do it lightly and resist a little bit. So let me just stop there. I realize we want more questions from the audience.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So let's open the floor to questions. I'll collect 3 at a time. So I see Andrew down there and then over there. If you could please introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the very incisive comments so far. Let me preface with the fact that I'm a medievalist, so some of my information is about 425 years out of date. But just to go back to the T word a little bit, we've seen this precedent, perhaps, maybe some might disagree with, was begun with the late Prime Minister Abe, of appeasement, of and so now both in business and politics we have the gifts and the I won't say boot kissing, but this is a proven pattern, and it's pragmatic in nature, and so even with those South Korean and Japanese politicians who would be expected to be rather different, as far away from Trump on the political spectrum as possible, you still see this policy. I'm wondering, as far as you're aware or able to say, would there be a demand on Trump's part that could cause or perhaps invite a bifurcation on either the South Korean side or the Japanese side? Is there a line where they're going to say, no, we're not going to bend the knee any further, if that's
a bifurcation with the United States.
with the U.S.
Pushing back.
Right.
Thank you.
Let's get the second one. I think there was on the left. Yes.
Hello. It was very nice to hear your insightful thoughts. So you were mostly talking about the institutional cooperation, very theoretical one. Some of you also mentioned the possibility for intelligence cooperation, so on and so forth. But the key issue, which has been in air so far, is the shipbuilding capabilities of the United States, which is very pragmatic one. As far as I remember, the U.S. Law for now prohibits the production of the ships abroad than U.S. for the military purposes, while the China is has already surpassed U.S. in terms of capabilities of shipbuilding. So, what prospects and what capabilities do you see so far in the future about the united U.S., Japan, South Korea shipbuilding capabilities? Thank you.
And last question, if anyone has them. Yeah, up here.
Thank you for sharing your insights. My name is Sang-Hoon Seok, and I'm a PhD candidate here. My question, I think, probably goes to Mr. Akita regarding a potential nuclear negotiation between the North and the U.S. Currently, there are many different goals about the ultimate goal of such a negotiation, ranging from complete denuclearization to CVID, which seems to be already dead, or nuclear arms reduction from the North Korean side. So if such a negotiation took place, do you think what will be the realistic goal of such a negotiation? And if the ultimate goal of the negotiation is not denuclearization, but freezing of the program, what will be the implications of such a deal to Japanese and South Korean security? Thank you.
Great. Shall we go in order of the questions? I think the first one was directed at Sheila, presumably, with the US. Yes.
I'm still very intrigued with a medievalist. I was thinking as you were speaking, we might need a medievalist to understand the dynamics afoot today. So pushback, is there a possibility, and really our two speakers from Japan and South Korea should address this, but yes, I do think there's plenty of potential for pushback, but at what consequence, I think. So we're talking about two democracies here, and clearly public opinion will matter. And where would the pushback come from in my mind? And I'm going to focus on the host nation support talks with Japan, just as an example. These are always delicate at home. I feel, too, that as I talk to Japanese officials and thinkers about Japanese long-term strategic defense investment and things like that, there is more desire today to invest in Japan's own capabilities, its own defense production base, which is problematic at the moment, than to pay a very high price, cost per head for the U.S. presence in Japan. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't want the U.S. presence in Japan, but I think the investment and going to the Japanese taxpayer to say, we're going to raise your taxes or give us more money, they're more likely to do it for Japan's own capability. And again, I'd love to hear Akita-san's point of view on this. So the pushback could come in that way, over exorbitant requests for money to keep the troops on the ground. President Trump on Truth Social and in preparation for the tariff agreement said, this U.S.-Japan alliance is not reciprocal. We do everything, they do nothing. So he's kind of floated, right? Maybe, we think about the security treaty. Is it really good for us or not? I don't think he's gone that far yet, but he certainly alludes to it, the inequity in the bilateral commitment. You hear a lot in the leadership race last time, not this year, but last time in LDP, about reciprocity, that Japan needs to think about offering reciprocity. I don't know that it's specific to Mr. Trump. It may be to Australia or to other partners in the region is the context I've heard people talk about it. Ishiba, Konotaro, people like that. So I think you could start to see pushback, maybe not the kind that you're expecting, but you may see it in the kind of rethinking about what Japan would prefer to do and would be ready to do than you've seen in, not necessarily demonstrators in the streets, but a reorientation in a way from the kind of conversations the U.S. and Japan have had. I'll allow, please, Mr. Yoon should jump in on South Korea on that one.
I'd like to answer the question about shipbuilding cooperation between the United States and South Korea. South Korean people are facing fundamental dilemma in the sense that President Trump has not yet made unequivocal guarantee about extended deterrence. And also there's a possibility that when a dialogue begins between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, South Korea may be somewhat alienated from the process. And that's a big concern for South Koreans nowadays. And one method they have been thinking to prevent all these things, to persuade American key policymakers to continue their commitment about South Korean security, is South Korea helping President Trump pursuing his goal of make America great again. In other words, rehabilitation of shipbuilding industries and other manufacturing industries, like defense industries or civil nuclear plant industry or something like that. But in terms of shipbuilding industry cooperation, I don't think the U.S. authorities are ready. For example, there should be some kind of removal of legal obstacles like Jones Act and some other laws inside the United States. But there's a strong lobby against changing this kind of laws. And I think they have not yet shown strong will to revise these laws so that South Koreans can make ships for the United States yet. So this is a problem inside American politics. And I don't know when there will be some kind of mutually agreeable solution or not. For example, recently the U.S. Immigration Office arrested 300 South Korean technicians in Georgia, and that shows some kind of confusion in American politics. On the one hand, they want to rebuild their manufacturing sector. On the other hand, their immigration policy, they don't coordinate those two goals in an effective way. So, it's a kind of difficult problem for South Koreans, to cooperate with American counterparts nowadays. Another concern from South Korean perspective is probably, there's some people expect that there would be a resumption of dialogue between North Korea and President Trump's the United States. Probably, I think there will be not much discussion about denuclearization, because from the beginning, Kim Jong-un declared that he would not come to the table if the United States insists on denuclearization. So even in case the dialogue resumes, probably the focus will be constraining more production of North Korean nuclear warheads. And in return, probably North Koreans may demand the American side removal of economic sanctions or something like that. So it's a kind of big dilemma, another dilemma for South Koreans nowadays we are facing. Let me stop there then. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So on the nuclear. Yeah, nuclear. Okay, nuclear, and quickly on the Trump. in pushing back. Yeah. So basically, I don't think Japan will openly push back to Trump in coming 3 years and a half. But the Japanese tactics is basically to save time. So smiling and present some, good proposal. But after all, Mr. Trump will, disappear within 3 years and a half if he will not run for the third term. So basically, Japan is trying to save time and then also try to mitigate risk by collaborating with other countries, like-minded countries, like India, Philippines, and Australia, Korea, South Korea. So this is slightly different from pushback. I hope it is more shrewd approach. But on the nuclear issue, I noted that Mr. Trump made a comment that, oh yes, North Korea is a nuclear state, nuclear power. I think this comment was made in March. So basically, in his mind, North Korea, actually it is a fact that North Korea have dozens of nuclear missiles. And if he really wants to solve this by negotiation, logically, he will be more tempted to embrace the reality that North Korea is a nuclear state in order to achieve some conclusion, some agreement. If he is not interested in negotiation with North Korea, he will be able to keep saying that, oh, they are not, they have to be denuclearized. So there is a trap for his temptation to get involved in the negotiation. So this is point number one. And number two, if your question is about if what will happen if U.S. acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear state? There are two ripple effects. One is that there will be more diffusion, more proliferation of nuclear, not only in Asia, but also in the Middle East. I pay attention to a deal agreement between Saudi and Pakistan last month. It is all, if Iran will have nuke, maybe this Saudi and Pakistan security agreement will mean something. And so likewise, North Korean acknowledgement of North Korea as a nuclear state is cause huge ripple effect. And second is about the prescription for Japan and also South Korea. Basically, I think it is not wise to jump on a nuclear option, but there are many other measures that ROK and Japan could take, starting from the nuclear sharing or do an exercise to deploy US nuke in time of contingency. So do a lot of military exercises to deter. So there are a series of measures before we jump on the nuclear option. So that I think that kind of discussion or debate will get intensified in Tokyo. Thank you.
Maybe just one point, yeah. I think the situation demands both countries. I mean, South Korea and Japan deepen its cooperation in the security area. For example, as of now, we have only one agreement, that is General Security of Military Information Agreement, GSOMIA. And that's the only one. But I think we need to conclude another two important agreements between two countries. For example, a reciprocal access agreement, RAA, and acquisition of cross-servicing agreement, ACSA, so that the two sides can jointly respond to potential North Korean aggression. Those two additional agreements will enable mutual logistical support and mutual use of bases and ports at the time of real, critical situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so I would take just a quick fire round of questions with very brief answers as well. If anyone has any pressing one. Yes, at the back.
Thank you, the organizer, for bringing great speaker, and thank you, the speakers, for your great comments. My name is Mi Hang. I'm a fellow at Newnham College here in Cambridge. I would like to bring our discussion back into the region geographically by the question regarding another trilateral cooperation, which is between China, Japan, and South Korea. And I would like to ask the speaker of Japan and South Korea, what do you think about the possibility of this trilateral cooperation? Because, for example, there's the foreign ministers meeting between China, Japan, and South Korea, and China also called for more cooperations. So what is the possibility of this trilateral cooperation given, for example, the new presidency of Lee Jae-myung, and also Dr. Smith also mentioned about the economic pressure, so there's a lot of economic cooperation between these three countries, and how much this possibility would affect the trilateral cooperation here that we're talking about between South Korea, US, and Japan? Thank you.
Thank you. So that's a tough question before lunch. So I I will give just 1 minute to each of the speakers to give some general thoughts on that, if you want, and then I think we need to leave the rest of the discussion to the lunch break. But
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I think China, Japan, South Korean cooperation is necessary, not only possible, to deal with economic issue, trade issue, and environmental issue. And China and these three countries are all members of RCEP, big trade, free trade zone, and also they are the framework of China, Japan, or Japan, China, or whatever, Japan, China, South Koreans trilateral summit meeting, and I expect that will happen. But because of the Japanese domestic situation, maybe not this year, but maybe next year, they will gather in Japan to discuss about those issues. So in short, this trilateral cooperation is solving problem framework. But there is a ceiling because China is not ally. But ROK and Japan are the ally of US and the shared value partner. So there is a ceiling. Ceiling is that we can cooperate to diffuse the tension among these three countries and also establish a contingency communication mechanism, which is necessary, but there is a limitation on the security domain or military domain.
I think this is related to the issue of the nature of international order these days. Nowadays, we cannot separate economic dimension from security dimension. And from South Korean perspective, what matters most important is security matters because of North Korean threat. And we are also depending too heavily on China. And so we, South Koreans, want to diversify economic dependency by strengthening our linkage with other countries in the world, so-called, global South, for example. So I think for the time being, what matters most important is security matters and how to make South Korea more secure in terms of North Korean threat. That will be priority number one, and that will affect how South Korean government will view in terms of importance of this trilateral mechanism. This is a useful mechanism at a peaceful time, but at this kind of very different period of international confrontation, I don't know. We had better wait and see how leaders are doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You want to say something? I'll be very brief. The question wasn't addressed to me, but the China-Japan-Korea trilat, I think is a very interesting sort of case study, if you will, about how this strategic dynamic between the United States and China and others are getting in the way of what should be natural cooperation on a host of issues, problem-solving issues. When it started in 2008, it was really about transborder issues, financial issues, payment. Can you use your card your automatic payment card in Japan and Korea and China? And the answer was yes. And it was to facilitate the flow of people back and forth across boundaries. But very quickly by 2009, it got focused on North Korea because that was the issue of the moment. And so I think, the ceiling that Mr. Yoon was referencing, I think the challenge here is when China says, no, we're not going to attend because we have problems, then the trilateral gets weakened in a way. So I don't think it's reached its full potential is another way maybe to say what Mr. Yoon was saying. I would definitely urge us not to see it as a competitor to the US-Japan ROK because it's designed for something different.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I don't want to stand between anyone and their lunch, so I think we're going to wrap it up here, but please join me in thanking our speakers for the wonderful contribution.